Good morning. This is my help video for week 5 of Spanish. So the way I'm going to approach this is I'm going to basically walk through what if you came into my office to meet with me and said, I don't get verb conjugations in Spanish. This is how I would approach helping you with that question. So what does it mean to conjugate verbs? Why should I care? How is this going to help me speak and write in Spanish? So first of all, to address that question of what this is, what's the big picture? We do conjugate verbs in English. We just don't think about it. We don't call it that. I don't stop and say, wait, what is the correct first person singular conjugation for the verb to walk? I just say, I walk to work. So we use verb conjugations all the time, but we don't stop and think about it. And the patterns in English are a little bit simpler. We don't have as many different distinct conjugations as in Spanish. So Spanish does have all these distinct conjugations, which makes the language in some ways more flexible because we can do things like drop off the subject of a sentence because it's clear from the verb conjugation who the subject is. When we talk about conjugating a verb, all we're doing is we're changing the form of the verb to agree with the subject of the sentence. So like when I say, when you hear a kid say, I is hungry, and his mom says, no, I am hungry. What she's doing is she's teaching him how to correctly conjugate the verb to be for the first person. And that's what we're going to be doing in Spanish. And this lesson is all about regular verbs. So this is a pattern that you can memorize. If you're a math or science person and you like patterns and repetition and taking things apart and seeing all the pieces and how they work together, you might actually like this a little bit better than some of the other language related tasks that we do, because that's what you're doing, is you're taking the verbs apart and then putting them back together in a way that works in the context of a particular sentence. So in Spanish, we have irregular verbs, which you've already started to learn. You learned the verb ser, to be, and we'll learn more irregular verbs throughout the semester. But there are 3 main groups of regular verbs that all follow the exact same pattern, and there are hundreds of them. So when you memorize this pattern, you'll be able to apply it across the board to many, many different verbs. And so the 3 different groups are AR verbs, ER verbs, and IR verbs. And I want to show you a tool that I have in Blackboard. So where you would find this in Blackboard is in course documents. And it's called, it's a verb chart that's filled in. And you'll see that I think it's like the 3rd item down has both a blank one as a Word document that you can pull up, or this one, which is a PDF. So what I have here is I have it filled in on the left-hand side with just the verb endings. So the first group of verbs is AR verbs. And these are the endings that go with AR verbs. So let's say you have the verb tomar, T-O-M-A-R. In order to conjugate, I'm going to take off that AR ending, and I'm going to replace it with these endings depending on who the subject of the sentence is. So if the stem, every verb has a stem and an ending. With tomar, the example that I'm using, the stem is that T-O-M, and then the ending, the default infinitive ending, is AR. And then these are the endings for the present tense for all the different kinds of subjects that we might use. So hopefully that makes sense. Then we have the second group of verbs. I told you there were 3. The second group of verbs is ER verbs, and this is the pattern for ER verbs in the present tense. And then we have IR verbs, and this is the pattern for IR verbs in the present tense. And then on the other side of this paper, I have an example of each of those. So here's an example of an IR verb. There's the stem that's underlined. We're going to take off the ending, the IR, and we're going to replace it with all of these other endings. So instead of vivir, which just means to live, if I want to say I live, you live, he lives, I'm going to replace that ending with a different ending. Vivo, vives, vive. Go up here to the example of an ER verb, comer, to eat. Our stem is that C-O-M, so we're going to take off the ER ending and replace it with these other endings that correspond to the different subjects. And then I have an example of an AR verb, hablar. So we have the stem, hablar, or the H-A-B-L. We're going to take off the AR ending and replace it with these other endings that correspond to the different subjects. I want to show you something that I have here on this file where I have written or typed in here first person, second person informal, third person and second person formal, then down here singular subjects and plural subjects. So with this grid, the way it's organized, we can help decide which subject we're going to use or which conjugation we're going to use, and we can narrow down our options. So if you know that the sentence that you're working with has a singular subject, you're just talking about one person, it's going to be one of these three conjugations. If it's a plural subject, it's going to be one of these three conjugations. If the person speaking, if it's first person, so the person speaking is or is part of the subject, it'll be one of these two. If it's someone who you're speaking to in an informal setting, it'll be one of these two. Now remember that vosotros is only used in Spain, so we won't see that in any of the My Spanish Lab materials. But I do always include it here just so that you have that exposure because you will see it in other materials sometimes, or if you ever travel to Spain, you'll hear vosotros extensively. Then down here, this is for third person and second person formal when you're talking to someone who you don't know well. Or in Latin America, talking to a group of people, whether formal or informal, you'll use ustedes. Now, a quick note about the subject pronouns and why we use these here. The reason that those show up in the conjugations is not that every subject is always going to be one of these pronouns, and that sometimes throws people off. They say, well, the sentence that I'm working with doesn't have any of these words in it. And that will be the case many times. But what they are is they're just a reminder to us of what the we use yo instead of saying first person singular, because yo is the default pronoun that we use for first person singular. In English, we would say I. In Spanish, we say yo. So that's what those are. So like, for example, él. Every sentence that you work with is not going to, even if it is third person singular masculine, it won't say él. It might say Juan or Jose or Carlos or mi amigo or mi hermano or mi papá. It could be any number of different things, but él is the pronoun that we would use to replace that noun. So we can't list every single third person singular noun here that could possibly be the subject of the sentence. But what we can do is we can list the pronouns that summarize those groups of nouns. So hopefully that makes sense and clears things up somewhat with what we're doing with verb conjugations. And now I'm going to switch over to the chart that I have in there as a Word document. So this is something that you could either fill in on your computer, type in the conjugations, or what I recommend even more is to print it and fill it out by hand, because a lot of times writing something by hand helps you remember it better. So let's say you're working with the verb escuchar. Okay? Escuchar means to listen. So what you're going to do when you conjugate this verb is you're going to decide, okay, what's the stem and what's the ending? In this case, the ending is AR, so that's the part that we're going to take off. The stem is this part, and that's the part that we're going to keep in each conjugation. Sorry, it's hard to see with that. Let's see if I can get rid of the squiggly line. Okay, so here's our stem, E-S-C-U-C-H. That'll be what shows up in every conjugation, okay? And then we remember from our other chart, if I switch back over here, that the yo ending will be o. So the conjugation for yo will be escucho. For tú, we're going to start with that first part again, E-S-C-U-C-H, and then the ending will be us. El, ella, usted, escucha. Nosotros escuchamos. Vosotros escucháis, and ellos, ustedes, escuchan. So we can do that with any number of verbs, just following this exact same pattern. All right, let's say we're using the verb, we'll choose an ER verb as an example now, and we'll say that the verb is beber, to drink. All right, we're going to do the same thing. We're going to identify the ending, which is ER, so we're going to use the ER conjugation pattern. Our stem is BEB, so our conjugations then will be, I'm going to start with the BEB. The yo ending for ER verbs is O. I'll switch back over so you can see that. Here's our endings for ER verbs. O, es, e, hemos, es, en. So as we conjugate it, I'm going to follow that pattern. So bebe es, él, ella, usted, bebe, because our ending is e. If it helps, if you're still kind of getting frustrated and overwhelmed by it, one thing that you can do is go through and just put in the stem for all of them and say, okay, I know that this part is going to stay the same. I know that each one of them is going to have this bib part of the verb. And then you can switch back and forth and say, okay, it's going to be hemos, so I add that. This one's going to be es, so I'm going to add that, right? And it may feel really tedious right now, but what it's doing is it's building those patterns in your brain and helping your brain make those connections with how this works and what we're doing with the verb, so that eventually it will become more second nature to you. So right now it's kind of like when you diagram sentences or memorize the multiplication tables, right? This is kind of like the multiplication tables of Spanish. So it sometimes feels like, well, learning what 5 times 7 isn't really going to help me that much in the long run. But it does, because you don't realize in your day-to-day life how much you are using what you know of multiplication in just little ways here and there when you're figuring out, estimating your grocery budget or anything like that. So same thing with verb conjugations. These are patterns that you're memorizing right now, and it feels really boring and dry, but it will build these patterns into your brain so that then you can pull them and you don't have to stop. Eventually you'll get to the point where you don't have to stop and say, okay, what is the second person informal conjugation for an ER verb, right? You just know it's going to be tú bebes, and it will become a more natural and easy thing to do. So I apologize. I probably should have changed this all to an easier to read font. And I apologize for that. I'm going to switch that here so that you can look at it for just a minute. But anyway, I hope that this is helpful for you. And if you have any questions or want to sit down with me in person and just hash this out for a while, I would be happy to do that, or over the phone or via an online conferencing, whatever works for you. This is a very fundamental building block of the language. And it's important that you understand at least the concept of how it works and how to apply the patterns. So please get in touch with me if you're struggling with how verb conjugations work. And I hope this was helpful, and I will see you online.